Hi, and welcome to the 25th video in our C# for Beginners tutorial series. So we've completely seen how to create our own class, and we've seen how to create an instance of the class. And we took a look at some collections, and now we're going to be looking at the last two types of collections here. And the first one that we're going to be looking at is going to be the hash tables. And the reason why I wanted to cover classes before looking at hash tables is you really get the benefit of hash tables when you're using your own custom style objects and your own custom classes with them. It just makes it for a much easier way to kind of demonstrate the use of hash tables and the different use cases and scenarios. So actually, let's go ahead and let's get started. So I'm using the same employee class that we worked on in the last couple of videos. So we are starting exactly where we left off. We have two employees here. We have a test employee and we have a Richard employee here. We're probably going to be creating some more, and we're also going to be getting rid of some of this code. But the first thing that we need to do is learn how to create a hash table. So kind of like everything else, we actually have a variable type called hash table. And we're going to name this employee, uh, let's name this employee table. And we are going to make that equal to a new hash table. Now you're going to say there's red squigglies under hash table. It doesn't actually exist. But if we actually look and see the show potential fixes, we're going to see that all we need to do is add the using system.collections semicolon. So I'm actually not going to click on it, but you can definitely click on it and it will automatically add it for you. But I just want to show you guys that it is just possible to add that using by yourself at the top here using system.collections, and the hash table will light up in green to tell you that it is a valid class. Perfect. So then all we need to do now is start adding our employees to this employee table, which is a hash table. So to add items into a hash table, you would then reference employee table, and then we could do a dot add, and then an open parentheses and a closing parentheses. And then within the parentheses here, we see that it requires a object key and an object value. So the key is a unique identifier that will be used to easily find that object that you're looking for, and then the object is the value. So what we're going to store in here is we're going to store as the key, we are going to store in test.employee ID, and then as the object or the value, we are going to put in a test. And what we're going to do is we're going to add in our other employee here as well. So we're going to add in Richard.employee ID, or Richard here. So we have our employees in here now. So now what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to actually go into here and grab an employee. So the simplest way to do it, since we already have our employees just right above here, we already know the keys that are going to be in there. What we could actually do is create an employee here and do test emp and make that equal to a employee employee table. And it kind of very similarly to the arrays, we're going to do a square bracket, and we're going to do let's do test dot employee ID for this one. Now we're going to get a red squiggly, and the error is cannot implicitly convert object to class employee. So we actually do need to convert this to the employee class, because currently it is an object. So all we need to do is cast that to employee, or cast it to the class that you need, and that is just done by doing a parentheses and then the class name in here. So we put in employee here. So we have our employee, and then all we can do here is just test emp dot print info, open and close parentheses, and then the semicolon. And if we actually go ahead and run this here, we are going to see at the bottom, we actually get our test employee again. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to erase all this extra info that we actually put in at the top here. So let's erase this print info. Let's erase all these console write lines. Erase this. So all we are doing is we are creating our two employees in two different ways. And we are actually just going and adding the employee here. So if we run this once again, there is our test employee. And if we did that exact same thing underneath here, and we did a Richard.employee ID, and we redid the test print info, we would get the test employee ID and now the Richard employee details. All right, so now this case is not very useful because in this case, why wouldn't I just reference the original employees? I'm really not doing anything other than just putting them in a table and then referencing them directly anyways. So what you can do is very similar to a array or an array list. We can actually iterate through them. So what we can actually do here is let me just erase this because it'll be quite similar. So what we can actually do is we can do a for each. And then what we can do is we can do employee e in employee table. Now, if we try to do this, and we do an e print info, we will actually get an error message. And we kind of seen this earlier when we tried to just assign the employee an item directly from the employee table. We got an error saying that it was an object. So this is really the same issue here. So what we would actually have to do, so there's two solutions to this. We can actually just dot reference the values directly here. And if we run this, we actually get our two employees. Or another way is to do a for each. And then we're actually going to do a dictionary entry, E, in employee table. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do employee temp emp is going to equal, once again, we have to cast it once again. So employee, and then we're going to say e dot value. And then if we do test temp emp dot print info, so now we should see both of them twice here. So we have the test, we have Richard, and we have test, and we have Richard once again. So we can loop through them. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and erase this one. And if we wanted to know all the different keys that are in that employee table, because we know that that's how we reference them, we can do that as well. So we can do a for each, and we could just do a, once again, it's going to be dictionary entry E in employee table dot keys. Then we would just go ahead, and I believe if we just do a console dot write line here and we do E, I think this is going to give me a error here because we are casting. So this actually would be, since all of our keys are integers, I believe that is why. Yes, so all of our keys in our case are all integers. So we can actually just loop through all the different keys here, and we are going to find out that they are just integers. So it would really depend on what you use as your key. But because I have integers, it is working perfectly fine with just this for each loop. Now, once again, it's pretty kind of useless to have a hash table if all you're going to do is kind of loop through the objects to kind of list them out or to reference them directly using the IDs that we have set. Usually a hash table would be used for a search of some sort, like you're searching, you're storing everything in there, and then you need to find an employee ID with a specific employee ID. So that's what we're going to write up here to actually show the real use case scenarios of these hash tables. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to prompt the user to enter an employee ID. So first, let's go ahead and let's prompt the user here. So we're going to say console.writeLine, please enter an employee ID. And then all we're going to do is just put a semicolon here. And then what we're going to do is do a string input emp ID. And we're going to make that equal to console.readLine open and close parentheses. And then all we want to do now is, because we know that we need to search for our employees using an integer, and that's because our employee ID is an integer field. Now we've actually seen this before. We've seen the try parse. So we will actually have to do that. But first, let's just see why we would have to do that here. So let's just say employee stored employee equals employee, and then employee table, and then input emp ID. And then let's just do stored employee dot print info open and close parentheses. So if we run this here, and it's going to ask us to enter an employee ID. If I put 1005, because I know that that is an employee ID, we get an exception here, and that is because the object reference not set to an instance of an object, and that is because right now this is a string and we need to put an integer in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to do an int try parse input emp ID, and then for out we're going to do int valid emp ID, and let's put that in here. So valid emp ID. So now if we actually go ahead and try this here, and we're going to put 1005, it works. We get back our employee. Now let's actually go ahead and let's test that application out a little bit more. So if we put in an A, we once again, we have an object reference not set to an instance of an object. If we go ahead and we put 100, we get that same error once again. And that is because if we put an invalid integer in our read line here, we're going to get the output of 0. So let's actually see this here. So let's console write line, and let's write out the valid emp ID value here. So once we actually go in here, if we put in the value of A, we get the value of 0. If we get the value of 100 here, it spits back out 100, which is fine, but for some reason it's still not finding it. And then 1005 does actually find it. And that is because if we give it an employee ID that is not inside the table, it will have an error saying it can't find this ID. It's not an item in the employee table. So what we need is we need to do some validation on the input of the user to make sure that one, the entry is an integer, and two, that the integer is actually a valid employee ID. So what we're going to just take care of for now is just make sure that it is an actual integer. So what we're going to say is while valid emp ID is equal to 0, we are going to go ahead and we are going to write out to the console. We're going to say invalid entry, please enter an employee ID. And we are going to do the input emp ID is equal to read line again. And we are actually going to just repeat that same int try parse. But here we can just out valid emp ID because the variable is already created. So if we actually do this now, and we have our please enter an employee ID. If I put in A, we get invalid entry, please enter an employee ID. If I type in test, we get the same thing. If I do 100 though, we still get that issue because 100 is not in the employee table. So what we need to do here is we need to add some type of other validation. So the employee table actually has, or hash tables, I should really say, have this interesting uh, property slash method on them. So what we can do here is we can say if the valid emp ID is 0, then we know it is not a valid entry. Or if the employee ID that was entered is not in the keys of the employee table. So what we actually have here is employee table dot contains key and then valid emp ID. So here we're saying if the valid emp ID is equal to 0, so we've entered something that was not a integer, it's going to give us back 0. And because we can't have an employee ID 0, if your employee IDs can have 0, this solution would definitely have a bug in it. And then we're saying that the employee ID contains the valid int, but we actually want to make sure that it does not. So because the while will only go in if it's true. So if it does not have the key, we need to have a not in there. So if it does have the key, it's going to be fine. It's going to keep going because it's going to say this is true. It contains the key, and then it's going to not it. So it's going to be false. So it's not going to go in this while loop. If the employee ID that we put in there is not in the employee table, this is going to give us false, but because we add the not in front of it, it's then going to make it true, which is then going to go ahead and bring us into the loop. And let's just actually go ahead and make sure that this logic actually works here. So if we have please enter an employee ID, we're just going to put in test, still works. We have invalid entry. If we put in 100, we get invalid entry as well. If we put 1005, we get back our employee of Richard Smith. And let's actually go ahead and let's just add some more employees here. So let's do test 1, test 2, test 3. And let's do 1000, 1002, 1004. So jacked 2, jacked 3, jacked 4. And let's add all these employees as well into our hash table. Let's add test 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So if we actually go ahead now and we put this in here, enter an employee ID, if we put in 1002, we get our JackedProgrammer programmer. So everything is working great. So the searches are working great as well. So this would be great for if you have some sort of like inventory system maybe, and you want to look up specific items based on their item number, and then you're storing the actual item in the hash table. This works great for employees as well, with the employee ID being that search ID or the key, and then the employee object actually being the object inside of it, or the value inside of it, I should say. So it is all key value pairs, very exactly the same as the PowerShell hash table, really. Everything is key value pairs. Your keys are your search index, and then your value is going to be your actually data inside of it, which is going to be most commonly probably an object. And then the ID is probably going to be the primary ID or a key related to that object. So I hope that kind of clarifies hash tables and kind of gives you guys a good idea of a scenario or a use case of where you would use hash tables instead of arrays or an array list. Because if you're just iterating through them, an array list or an array is definitely more than fine. And then our next one we are going to be looking at is dictionaries. So make sure to tune in for that. Also, please be sure to subscribe and hit the like button as well and hit that notification bell to be notified of that next video. And always, if you guys have any questions or comments, please let them down below and I will be sure to get back to you. Or if it's something that could benefit a lot of people, I will definitely be making a video on it. And I will see you guys on the next video.